if you didn't sell, you had to stand on your chair and you'd get like smacked. I don't mean smack in a kinky way, but you'd get like kind of smacked on your bottom if you didn't do it, or your hand. So you were driven to like, shit, I don't want to be like picked on, so I'm going to sell.
Wow.
I mean, it definitely worked as a motivator. And you had to walk up and write your name on the board when you'd sold something. But I learned so much at that time, both how to do it. And that's the thing I've seen throughout my life. I'm an avid learner.
Hi, and welcome to A Class of Their Own podcast, revealing the human stories behind their name. We will hear honest and intimate reflections from our guests who, despite their circumstances, shape a world that reflects their unique visions of success. Join me, Mira Magecha, to learn from these inspirational people and take the first step to make your own change. On today's episode, we're joined by Nishma Patel Robb. Hi Nishma, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. How are you?
Good. I love what you're wearing.
Oh, thank you.
It's nice to add some sparkles, and it's as if you knew we have a green.
I've coordinated.
Yeah.
I know. I love that.
It's amazing.
I know. Sparkles are not just for Christmas; they are for every day.
So we start the podcast with you telling the audience who Nishma is.
Who Nishma is. So I am a 51-year-old mummy of 16-year-old boy-girl twins, a gorgeous little doggy, a very wonderful ex-husband, so I'm an ex-wife of a lovely man, and a mischief maker.
Mischief maker. I love it.
Who likes wearing sequins.
Who loves wearing sequins. I love that. That's great. And so talk to me about your journey of how you've maybe not got to here, because I think that's a long journey, to just right now.
What, because I'm 51?
Yeah, as in, not literally.
Good 5 decades.
Not literally to the studio. But where did you grow up? Where did it all start?
So the bits that are interesting, actually, when you asked me that, it's funny, isn't it? I didn't say anything about which I think most people do, don't they? Their kind of cultural heritage. So I am Gujarati, as the Patel is a bit of a giveaway in.
Yeah.
I'm the youngest of 3 girls, and I was born in Watford, grew up in Watford in a place called Bricketwood.
Yeah.
So as a child of the 70s and 80s, it was a kind of a brilliant and also tough time to be growing up in Britain at that time. And definitely that kind of sense of identity, which I'd, having been born here and raised in a fairly liberal way, actually felt very British. My mum and dad are creatives at heart, not necessarily how they produced, kind of pursued in terms of careers, but they fell in love and got married, which again was very much against the grain and the norm, which probably meant we didn't have what a lot of, we didn't necessarily have a kind of a firm community, because my mum's a Shah, my dad's a Patel.
Okay.
Which means they're both Gujarati, which you'd think is that's enough.
Yeah.
But isn't actually back then when they went off and did that in the 1960s. And so it's interesting, I suppose, that the influences from when I was really little and growing up were quite varied and have definitely kind of lived through me. And, it's only at points like this and conversations like this that I get to kind of stop and reflect. But my mum and dad did like fine art degrees. So the house was always full of art and music. My mum used to play the sitar a little bit as well.
Nice.
So a lot of classical Indian music, a little bit of that kind of really brilliant 1960s Indian film music. It was kind of almost a bit pre the more glitzier Bollywood. It was slightly more kind of poetic and beautiful in terms of the music that filled us. But they were avid vinyl collectors. So, my memories of just seeing lots and lots of music around the house and lots of art. And they were really funky how they decorated the house, which I can only really reflect on now, which I think was incredibly brave of them and really embracing the 1970s. And then at the same time, we would avidly watch Top of the Pops, me and my sisters. And so we were very much in terms of kind of, I suppose, Western music. And without getting into all the complications of the very many things that my mum and dad did, but he at one stage had a shop in Wardour Street, which was like a fashion boutique. And I was probably about 4 years old at the time, 3 or 4 years old, and I would go there with my dad sometimes, which was, kind of like, I think about it now and think, it was like I'd be there till midnight and then no one ever thought of it. But I always remember they used to have these huge speakers, mum and dad loving music, huge speakers, and they would blast out 1970s disco. And so I just remember from such a young age being in love with Donna Summer and dancing with Donna Summer, or remembering when Grease came out when I was probably like 4 or 5 years old and acting out there. So I think kind of that music and art was such a big cultural shaper for me.
Yeah.
Much more so than I would say a more traditional Indian upbringing.
And it is so different because I don't know, and I know quite a lot of Indians, given my background, that had that at that period or in that period, relatively traditional. They might have just been coming over, bringing families, bringing all of that stuff. I don't recall anyone having anything Indian culture, yes, but not culture of different culture and bringing that all together. That sounds fab. Was it fab?
Yeah, it was. I think, well, I suppose in some respects you don't know any different.
Yeah.
So you assume in many respects that's how everyone else's, kind of upbringing and environment is. I think it was challenging without knowing it is. And again, so much of this on reflection. But I remember at the time and growing up through that period, there was definitely a sense of not fitting in.
Okay.
So in some respects, it made me really tight with my sisters because there's a bit of an isolation to realise that, we didn't have a lot of family, an extended family. So what limited extended family, you knew you couldn't relate to them in quite the same way because they were, likely to be a little bit more traditional. But we didn't necessarily fully fit in with like kind of the friends at school and suffered a huge amount of racism, which was completely bewildering to me because I felt so British. So I couldn't really understand that sense of hatred. And I always remember when, you used to see the kind of NF signs, sprayed on our windows and our walls and everywhere, everywhere I'd go. I remember being fascinated by the design of it, which is clearly my parents' daughter, and the seamlessness of how the N would run into the F, rather than kind of pondering deeper into kind of the why. For me, it was just like, I can't understand why someone would hate somebody else in that way. And when they would shout lots of, really horrible things, and particularly that kind of go home, it was like genuine, like, well, I don't understand, I am home. So I think that sense of a lack of belonging could have been the negative.
Yeah.
I think the positive was a huge amount of independence. So we were incredibly independent. And in some respects, you kind of just forge your own little space between me and my sisters. So, whether it was listening to pirate radio stations, being absorbed in music, we all love music a lot. Definitely, we have that from our parents, but being just really open to culture. So everything from being open to a wide variety of things you'd watch, you'd listen, you'd read. My sisters used to tease me. I used to go to bed when I was really little, reading the Bible every night. And it was just a fascination of stories. For me, it was, I never went deeper in terms of thinking that's allowed and that isn't.
Yep.
For me, it was blurred lines everywhere. It was just content.
And it was how you absorb it and what
you take from how it made me feel.
Yeah.
I'm a dreamer, when I was tiny, my mum would say to me, I was such a storyteller to the point that some people were like, almost like, oh, I don't want to sit next to her because she's just going to like, and I would find anyone I could, often when I was quite little, old people who had lots of time on their hands and were quite grateful for this little girl coming, can I tell you a story? But also I would daydream. So I think what the stories gave me in some respects made up for some of the reality. So almost when you're in a pocket and your limited reality is kind of what you see on TV or the magazines that I had to read in an absence of the internet and all of that kind of richness that you could have, was my imagination. So the stories, whether it was through books or things I watched or I read, that was kind of my new reality. So I lived in this kind of flitting of daydreaming to reality in that. And I went to India when I was just once when I was, in younger years. I've been since, but probably about 4 years old. Okay. And I have a few memories of that time. But it felt like I was visiting somewhere. It didn't necessarily feel like, oh, I'm going home. I just felt like I was visiting. So that was weird.
The first time I went to India, I was 11 and it did not feel like home. And Mum and Dad would talk about it as, we're going home. And I was like, no, home for me is where we've just left. We're on holiday. And that was a very bizarre experience. What was it that teachers would say about you in terms of your school reports?
So I was, always too talkative. A chatterbox would always be repeatedly on there. Chatterbox, daydreamer, huge amount of potential. I was, very curious as a child. And, probably up until my teenage years was pretty diligent and a little bit square in some respects, but really boisterous. I was in no way an introvert. I wanted to be kind of in the middle of things and engaged. But it was definitely a more disruptive and distracting, perhaps, rather than disruptive force in the class. So I, in the latter years, I always remember I ended up making head girl, which was completely bizarre to me because I wasn't a particularly well-behaved student. And the headmistress was terrifying, Mrs. Cooper. And I remember her saying to me, it's just me and her in the room. It's one of those moments where you're like, And she said to me, I'm making you head girl because you have followership, which I didn't even understand what that really meant at that age. You're like, what? But she says, people listen to you. And so I'm making you head girl because then maybe you'll make some better choices.
Wow.
And I remember at the time thinking, well, I remember thinking, what? And at the time, there was a bit of me that was like, yeah, I'm going to do really good and do it. And obviously, it was quite short-lived because what I immediately just thought was great. I can just boss a load of other people around. Because having had two older sisters who were such a force in my life, I'd never had anyone to boss around and they'd continually boss me around.
Yeah.
But were incredibly nurturing and loving as well. And, my mum was a classic homemaker, incredibly creative and really hardworking. And my dad, who I'm probably much more like in some ways, like both of them, but my dad he's a hustler, and he's a maverick. And so I had this kind of definitely both those traits when I went into school.
And what happened post-school? What was it that you wanted to do when you were leaving school, thinking about what careers, life looked like? What was that imagination, that daydreaming that was coming back to you?
Yeah, so for me, it was always around, I clearly wanted to do something with stories and talking because that was identified as a clear gift and a passion. So at that age, that really limited set of what are the job opportunities, it was, right, I want to be a TV presenter. Because in my mind, it was like you got paid to look nice and talk a lot, which sounds like sounds like a perfect job. But the reality was, of course, was then I was like, right, how do I get to be that? Oh, you'd have to be a journalist. And of course, at school, it was always like, I think you should consider, maybe a teacher, maybe a nurse, great wholesome professions, but we're never going to be anything that I was interested in. Yeah. So I was really frustrated with this lack of opportunity that presented itself. So in my head, I was like, right, I'm going to be a journalist because if I can be a journalist, then I can get a job at the BBC or wherever and I'll work my way up from there. And I remember writing one summer, I must have been about 17, so just before I was going to university. And I hand wrote about 100 letters, sent them off to all the magazines, went through, worked out who the names were, very industrious like that. I never had anyone to kind of put, never had a hand at my back to do that. Mum and Dad weren't very pressing like that in some ways. They would flit a little bit between, I think, their own personal challenge of like, we should be more strict with them because, to have 3 daughters in our culture was seen as a weakness and they were very defensive about that. Yeah. But I think at the same time that pull of guilt of like, oh my God, we've got 3 daughters, we don't want it to be a liability. Not that we ever were, and they were incredibly proud of us. For more complicated reasons not going now, they had to move abroad, which meant from about the age of 15, 16, I didn't have anyone telling me what to do. So it was a real self-motivated drive to fulfill that dream. Anyway, wrote these letters, didn't hear anything back, wrote them again. And on the second time around, Marie Claire magazine wrote back and said, okay, we'd like to offer you an internship for the summer. So I just thought, this is my dream job. Marie Claire at the time was considered the serious glossy magazine. Yeah. And I got to work with Michelle Lavery, who was the features editor at the time, which is amazing. I still remember her name. I can't remember most things, but I remember her name. And I just remember rocking up and I had never seen anything like it because I'd never been surrounded by women in business, of that business. My mum was obviously a woman in business, but it was our own shop and that. Didn't have any other role models. So I was such a fish out of water, like, what do you wear? What do you say? What do you do? It was, hardly reflected on TV. So it was a real kind of baptism of fire moment. Anyway, off I was sent to go research male gold diggers at IPC libraries, which I know is a random. I obviously now know a lot about male gold diggers. And I thought this was the best thing that could ever happen to a girl. I was sitting getting paid, not a lot of money, but in a dream job in a library, which is in the old days. It makes me sound ancient, but digitalization. It was like little microfiche, and you went there and you pulled out the magazines, and I would sit and read magazines to research male gold diggers and Elizabeth Taylor and all sorts. About 5 days into this job, it's a gorgeous summer as well. So I'm sweltering it outside. I'm sat in here it's pin drop silence, it's quiet, and it's really lonely. And I start to think, this isn't for me. And then sitting down to struggle to kind of write what would have to be kind of the notes that went into the final interview, I just realised it wasn't a natural thing for me. And so when I used to keep going back into the office every so often, I'd peer around the other teams, you know, the fashion team looked like they were having fun, and the beauty team with all their things. And then there was the advertising team, the advertising sales team, and they looked like they were having the best fun. And I just remember that summer thinking, maybe journalism isn't for me. Maybe I need to get into advertising. So off I went to do my degree, which was a politics degree, which was one of those marvellous humanities degrees that actually trains you to do nothing, because I definitely wasn't going to be a politician. But it didn't matter. You know, for me, it was all just a bit of a like, okay, get to that stage. And being self-motivated enough to get there, because there wasn't a hand at my back to push me. There wasn't the financial means to fall back on. It was pretty much on my own and with my sisters from the age of 16.
This episode is brought to you by Play for Change. Play for Change brings together leadership coaching, expert facilitation, and builds communities. They help craft real connections, spark learning, and turn play into powerful experiments to enable better relationships with yourself and others around you. To find out more, go to playforchange.co.uk. Links are in the show notes below. Where does that push and drive to go to university come from? Or was it just, this is what we do, this is a process, and until I've done that, it's just the thing?
Yeah, so I think there was a bit of it was definitely a sense of going, if I don't do that, what's the alternative? So money was really, really tight. And so being motivated by going, I need to earn enough money to have security.
Right.
I could see the challenges that we had faced as a family. I was facing very much of that crisis at that time. There was no security in my life at all.
And where were you living and staying? Because your parents weren't in the country at the time.
It was just me and my sisters. My elder sister is 7.5 years older than me. Yeah, so she was pretty young as well, but old enough for us to live together. And we were living in rented accommodation, moving every 6 months.
Yeah.
So it was tough. You know, it was tough on them as well. Both my sisters, who middle sister had been at uni, and she came back early, and we were effectively looking after each other, and they always looked after me. And I'm incredibly grateful for the sacrifices they made for me. So there was a little bit of like, I owe it to them as well. And I just felt like, well, if I go to uni, I can get a better job. And if I can get a better job, I can earn some money. And I had this belief that, you know, I didn't know exactly with the direction. I still kind of hoped for the TV career, but I knew that had fallen away. Also, because the amount of times people said to me, whether it was family, my mum and dad included, but others, and school, said, oh, there's nobody like you in TV. And that's the thing. You kind of look and go, there isn't anyone like me. Why on earth do I think I'm going to get a job there? So that dream was starting to slip away fast.
Yeah.
So then it just became a motivation of, I just need to earn enough money to get myself out of the hole that I felt like I was in.
And you went down the advertising route?
I did. Roundabout way. So I wanted to be a marketeer, came out of university in the middle of a recession again in 94, and there just weren't any jobs. And I applied. Look, I think it's two things. This is why the value of having people around you or the resources around you to guide you are so critical. I had nobody to tell me, this is how you prep for those grad schemes and the interviews. This is what to expect. I didn't even really understand the difference between the different organisations that I was going for. I would judge it by the prettiness of a brochure. I remember
And
at one
their brand,
stage,
yeah,
their brand, or what I might know of some of the products, you know, so whether it was P&G or Unilever, didn't mean a huge amount other than that they had the big grad schemes and a weighty process, and I knew some of their products. I always remember going for the Chase Manhattan Bank. You know, I didn't want to go into banking, but I just thought, well, they had an office in New York, and I was like, well, I want to go there because then I might get to go to New York. And so I no real guidance at all, didn't get a job anywhere. I remember everything from British Gas to like a real spectrum of places. And I really needed the money. I had racked up loads of debt, not through any foolish living, because I worked all my way through university as well, but it's just a reality of living. So I got a job as a salesgirl on a magazine that was called Marketing and Campaign Magazine, the two most famous titles in the advertising industry. And there was a logic in my head that said, well, if I go work there, I'll learn a bit more about the advertising industry and then I'll find my way in. And I started there as a sales girl, and it was bloody hard. You know, it was none of the stuff they did, I think, was politically correct now when I look back.
No,
you know,
of course
and if you didn't sell, you had to stand on your chair And you'd get like smacked, I don't mean smack in a kinky way, but you'd get like kind of smacked on your bottom if you didn't do it, or your hand. So you were driven to like, shit, I don't want to be like picked on, so I'm going to sell.
Wow.
I mean, it definitely worked as a motivator. And you had to walk up and write your name on the board when you'd sold something. But I learned so much at that time. Both had to do it. And that's the thing I've seen throughout my life. I'm an avid learner. Maybe not in the traditional sense, because I don't necessarily like the confinements and the deadlines, but I like and I'm curious to learn. And so if I knew that I've got to be the best at this, I'll learn really hard. But the money was shit. The money was so bad. And so I could barely afford to kind of get to work each day and have any money. And then the worst thing is, it was a tough job and a very social job. And as you went home from the office in Lancaster Gate, you went past this really lovely pub called the Mitre, and everyone would go for a drink at the Mitre. So any earnings I had were then getting spent in the pub. And even though I was really kind of as wise as I could be, I remember I used to count out in pound coins. I used to go to the bank and take out as much money I needed for the month, which was something like, I think I had to make £300 last me a month outside of like rent and travel. And I used to, so I just try and save up during the week so I could at least go out the weekend. Anyway, it was clearly not a sustainable way to live. And a friend of mine who had been at Haymarket had gone and left, and he came to the pub one evening and he said, he looked great. And I was like, oh, what are you doing? He said, oh, I work for Teletext. He said, they've got some jobs there, you should come. They pay £14,000. I didn't care. It could have been bloody anywhere. For an extra £4,000, I was going. I didn't even have teletext on my telly, but I just pretended I did. And off I went, and I blagged my way, as much of my life has been, is this phenomenal blag. Throughout university, I used to blag my way into places and that, hustled my way, whatever you want to call it. And I got this job, and I started as a salesgirl in 94 at 21 years of age. And within 8 years, I was 6 years sales director, then became the managing director about another 2 years after that.
At Teletext.
Yeah, and so literally I went from bottom sales girl to the top of being managing director of the business. And that, all of that, if I look through that time, was just a blind ambition to achieve security. That's all it was. I needed enough money to know that I could have somewhere to live, that meant I didn't have to move every 6 months, that I could try and get my mum and dad to come back by showing them there was some security.
What about your sisters at this point?
So my sisters also worked crazy hard. By the time I started working, my elder sister had got married and she'd moved to Leeds, which was really hard for us because we'd been so tight, the three of us. Middle sister was starting to work in her career and stuff. And we were close, but we weren't living together at that stage. But we were always very close to each other because we had a shared history and stories that no one would ever know or understand for what we'd been through as kids.
And was this something at the time that you shared in terms of what was going on for you, going to the pub and saving that £300 and going, actually, that's what I've got to live on for the month?
No,
or
I
was
don't.
that just
I don't think we ever
never
talked about it. No,
it?
it's really funny actually. I've never talked about it. You've just said that now, and it's made me go, God, I never said that. You know what? Because I think we all had a way of hacking our lives. We looked after each other, and I'm sure there's things that they were doing that I didn't. I remember at a time when I was at uni, all three of us were working. That summer I worked 3 jobs. I'd literally get up in the morning and do a job during the day. I'd do a shift in the evening at McDonald's. I'd do another shift at the weekend at a coffee shop. And I was literally working 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. But so were my sisters, who had both had sort of office jobs during the day, bar jobs at night. And we were doing it because we needed to get some money together to make sure we could live. And so there was a sense of that's what you just did. You didn't question it. That was the norm. So I think if there'd ever been license or permission to have a bit of woe is me, I've got to do this, there might have been, but there wasn't.
And there was no woe me, because that's not the times we grew up in. The times were, this is what you've got to do and get it done.
I think it was, and it's weird because I remember being 8 years old and going to school with my sister, and you'd get spat on every day by the skinheads. You'd have to go through this underpass to not have to cross a busy road. And you just learnt to kind of take a deep breath and run as fast as you could, because if you didn't run, you'd get beaten up. And I remember the first time it happened, coming home and running into my mum and saying, Mum, this is what happened. And she just went, oh, look, these things are going to happen. You just have to be careful. That happened to my kids now, I would be going insane. And that's not because my mum didn't love me. Of course she didn't. She worries about her grandchildren more than us, but that's like a different time.
That's a different dynamic.
But it was almost that kind of lack of drama that was really helpful, because there was never a drama around these moments. You just started to kind of, I'm not saying desensitise to it, but you just learnt to go, well, okay, this is it. I've just got to get on with it. So I think we pulled together as a family, all of us, through two things, which was one, a huge amount of humour. My dad's really very cheeky and humorous, and even in the toughest times, all of us still had our humour. Between me and my sisters, we've always had that humour in the most bleakest of moments. So I think the thing of having kind of that humour and no drama meant there was no woe is me. And weirdly, that's been an incredible asset. And at times, probably much later in life, it's been a weakness, because not that I can't empathise with others, but when others haven't been able to cope with their situations, I don't think I was as sympathetic as I probably could have been, because I had a bit of a like, just get on with it, which is, not necessarily fair.
Yeah. And so what leads you to marrying your husband? And well, I suppose let's get to marrying your husband, meeting him.
Yeah, so I worked crazy hard. That's the one thing. I didn't wear it as a badge of pride. It's not even something that's just what you did. And I really wanted to get on. And I'm sure there was a huge amount of imposter syndrome that fueled my drive to work as an artist. And I loved what I did, but it meant I spent a lot of time at work. There wasn't a huge amount of socialising. My friends, who I still am friends with now, were the friends I made literally at university on the first day, and we've stayed friends ever since. And there's kind of a crew of people there. But other than that, and I was very friendly with people at work, because you spent so much time there, and I really liked them. And I think there's something special about wherever you work in your 20s becomes a real base of a lot of your friendships, because you grow up together. So Dan worked at Teletext as well in the sales team. He didn't work directly for me, but he worked for someone who worked for me. So it was a bit of a taboo thing, because I was the boss and he was somebody who was more junior in my team, but epically brilliant at what he was doing. And we fell in love, and we wanted to get married, and we had to kind of get a bit of clearance from work because there. And I was really conscious that he was going to get a really hard time, because he was, and I'm sure all his friends tried to dissuade him to go, don't marry the boss. But he, it was brilliant. He's Scottish. He's incredibly funny and witty. And he was probably the first man I'd really met who was not intimidated by my achievements or my very strong-willed way. I'd been so fiercely independent that I was never a bra-burning type of girl, but I was clearly knew what I wanted and believed in fairness and would stand up for others. So for him, what I liked about it, and maybe it was just his Scottish nature, is he was quite happy to go, no, enough, put me in my place. And I'd never really had that. I think I was way too strong-willed. Anyway, so we fell in love at work and had lots of approval, but I knew he had to kind of move on after that, because I think it's impossible to work with someone that you're in a relationship with, because you never know if you're being too kind or not, or too unkind, as I probably was. I was overcompensating for him there. But we had this beautiful Scottish wedding. I always wanted to get married in this Scottish castle, and with not having a huge amount of family. And actually, I could, with any Indian person, Gujarati people particularly, you could have an endless wedding.
God, yes.
So I was a bit like, I don't even know any of these people, so I don't really want to invite them. So happy to those that I like and we know, but I hadn't spent a lot of time in a big community, which I had realised was really, really different from many of the other Indian friends that I had, which I sort of acquired more through university. So we decided to get married in Edinburgh, even though he's from Dundee. But we got married in Edinburgh, and we had a Braveheart meets Bollywood wedding.
Oh, how beautiful.
All of the women, both sides of the family, all wore saris, and all of the men, including my dad, wore kilts.
That is very untraditional.
Yeah.
How beautiful.
It was really lovely. And I managed to find a band that would play the doll drum as well as the bagpipes. And so we made it like a real fusion between our two cultures.
Yeah. And the acceptance of the fact that there is a difference in culture, and not hiding it and going one dominates over the other or anything like that.
Although that probably later did. But Dan was again, as well as being incredibly supportive and accepting of who I was as a person, he was so open-minded about the culture, and I loved that. I'm very close to my family, so anyone I met needed to be kind of a real family person. And he just absorbed, the family, the kind of mayhem and chaos that is my family. But also, it's like that kind of big Greek wedding, big Indian families, the obsession of food and all of that. He just fitted in perfectly. So we wanted a wedding that was acknowledged both our cultures, that one didn't dominate the other. It was a humanist ceremony, and there's things like that. I look back and think, oh gosh, I would have loved an Indian wedding, but for me, there was too many complications and ties to it. But it was a beautiful day, that I think signified very much who we were as people.
And what about sharing with your family and your parents, your sisters, that you were going to marry Dan? And I'm going to assume there was very little reluctance. Yeah,
there was no resistance to it. So my eldest sister married a Punjabi guy, and as being the eldest, I think there was
She said it.
She said it, and I think my parents kind of knew that we were way too strong-willed to ever consider having an arranged marriage, and I think because we weren't part of that community, it felt so alien to think. I think if I'd come home and said I was going to marry a Gujarati boy, I think they would have been more shocked and concerned, because they would have been like, oh God, what are we going to do now? Because we're going to actually have to integrate a bit more. So I think it kind of suited them as well, that there wasn't this sense of kind of free will and independence. And I know how lucky I am to have parents that were so supportive of just wanting us to be happy. And I think not just happy, but finding someone who was an equal was really important to them. So my older sister married a Sikh guy. There was a little bit of resistance, but that's nothing more than kind of external pressure that they thought, oh, is this the right thing? Very much part of the family, and always was, as soon as she decided, as soon as they kind of proceeded to get married. And my middle sister married an English guy who's white as well. So there was no expectation.
When did they come back?
So they came back about 17 years ago.
And
so I'd been married. So that's, I'd been married 3 or 4 years at that time.
Okay. So it wasn't while you were working. It was after that.
So I'd already started working. So I'd been working for quite a long time. And Dan and I were together. We'd been married a few years. I'd since left Turtex and done various other roles and things. He'd also left. I got him to leave Turtex before I did. And he went off to work at Google, which was kind of like we crossed paths again very briefly there for a few weeks. But Mum and Dad came back fortuitously. I got them back not long, a year or so before I started my IVF treatment. So I feel like it's been such a gift that they were able to be back here and support me through having my twins. And they have been in my twins' life from day one.
And you've been quite open about your IVF treatments, haven't you?
Yeah, I think it's funny because culturally, it was like, no, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why?
You don't tell anyone until after the 12-week scans,
and all
even
of
then,
that.
and you don't buy anything until the babies arrive.
But even like having the IVF, they didn't want, not my family were fine with it. My mum and dad were fine with it, but extended family were, it was almost like don't mention it. Like it was an illness, like I'd done something wrong, which I thought was bizarre because, and also my nature is to be really open about it. This is just, these things happen. And, there are many, many people that do it. And it was really frustrating to not be able to have children. And it was hard. It was really, really hard, particularly when you go through that stage, or all your friends look like they're going off having kids and it's unexplained as to why you can't. But at the same time, I was hugely lucky. I was successful on my first round of IVF, and I know how rare that is. And also then to have twins. So they were much wanted and hugely loved in terms of that process. It was a very difficult process and a very difficult pregnancy, and I became quite ill in it and ended up being in hospital quite early, and they were born 8 weeks early. But I think it's really important to talk about the non-linear lines that we live in life, and mine's definitely not been a linear line in any way, and that very rebellious, mischievous attitude and approach to life has filled every aspect of what I've done. But I also think of it sometimes as thinking, I never thought it was special. I just thought it was different. But now I reflect and go, was I different, or is it just because no one else said anything? Because I think there's also that. Is like, do we only hear the aggregated stories of what happens versus the
real stories,
realities of that? And I think most of us go through life craving the knowledge that you're not the only one.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I was quite open to it. For me, it didn't feel like failure. It felt like science and, progression. So, yeah, I think IVF is an incredible development of science that gives so many women that opportunity of having children.
And so you have the twins, a boy and a girl.
Boy and a girl. Anushka and Oscar.
Oh, how beautiful. And what happens next? What happens to careers? What happens to life?
So
where are you living as well at this point?
So Pinner, we'd moved to Pinner at that stage. I'd moved there a few years before. Actually, before I'd got together with Dan, I'd sort of... It's interesting how we all kind of gravitated back to each other. So prior to that, university and various things, I sort of lived towards London a lot more, or in West London. But one by one, me and my sisters sort of started as they got older and they had kids. My elder sister's got her daughter Threa, my middle sister's got her son Rashan. We kind of all ended up... I just didn't want to be away. I didn't want to be apart from them. I wanted to be nearby because we were so close to each other. So when the opportunity came to go, actually, I want to move and live a bit nearer, I did.
Okay.
And so we still live minutes away from each other, all of us, which is very funny. But I had, the quick kind of career jumps was, I had the teletext career, which was amazing and really challenging towards the end. And I actually, worked really closely with the Daily Mail Group and Lord Rothermere, and that was another story in itself. I did a stint in a small business, which was a big learning curve and not particularly enjoyable in the latter stages. And that's when I went off to have my IVF. And I knew then, after having the kids, I didn't want to return to the job I'd done before. So when I took nearly 18 months off because I hadn't been well and because the kids hadn't been well. So by the time I came back to the world of work, it was like pressing reset because it was 2008. I had the kids in 2008. It was 2009 when I was effectively coming back into the workplace. And we'd had the crash, we'd had the dot-com boom and bust, and the world looked different. So everything I'd learned before almost wasn't relevant. And so it was really hard to go, I have literally pressed reset on my career, having spent such a hard time climbing, you then kind of like drop like a stone. But I would, never want to be defeated. And knowing I wanted to work, I loved being a mum, I loved being around the kids, but I knew it was just, I wasn't myself. It's like that loss of identities. And I think I've always struggled with identity my whole life. It was difficult.
Yeah.
So I went into a digital agency, very grateful that a friend of mine invited me in to kind of work with them. And I did that because I thought, great way to learn about everything again is in a digital agency. So I learned all about media again, worked with them. I became a partner of that agency. We sold it to a larger agency. I was there for a few years, and then came along Google. And Dan was at Google at the time, but he'd been there 9 years and was about to leave. He'd kind of felt like he'd done his time. So because we'd always said, we don't want to ever work together again. And so when I think people had heard that I was joining, I think there was a bit of suspicion about, was he leaving? And sure enough, he did. And so I joined Google in 2014, having had, sort of the first half of my career had been very commercial and sales. The second half had been all marketing. And I went into what I thought was my dream job. So the kids were 5 years old. Mum and dad had been like a significant support, as had my eldest sister. They really were kind of frontline support and carers for me and the kids. And so from tiny, the opportunity to go back to work, I started to work from when the kids were about 2 years old.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been able to do it without them.
Yeah.
There's just no way. You just cannot do it.
Yeah.
And it's not even just the affordability of loads of nannies. Actually, the other challenges with having a very, very dominating Indian family is like, no, you can't leave them with a stranger and we'll do it. But, how lucky am I? I've had family to raise my kids, and cook for them and look after them and nurture them. So
and still have the integration of who you are and share all of that and be connected.
And respectful of cultures, So yes, they probably lean slightly heavier towards the Indian culture because they've been with my mum and dad so much, but mum and dad have always been really respectful that there's, another half of their culture as well. And so I just don't think I would have been able to go. This is why I always kind of you have to tell people these things. Lots of people go, oh my God, you went from there and then you had kids and then you did this job and you had this really big job. Yeah, I did, but only because there were things in my life that facilitated that. So having, it wasn't the perfect support system. It was in some ways, it wasn't in other ways, allowed me to do it.
Yeah.
And the other ways were meant, when you're asking family, you feel like you're asking favours. So almost if you're paying for the help, it starts to become easier. Not that there wasn't sort of financial reward in it. It's more you just don't want to take the piss with it.
Yeah.
But 2014, started the job at Google. Kids are 5 years old. And I found it really hard to start with because, besides massive imposter syndrome, because everyone's super bright and brilliant and it's a big company and it's really complex and it's probably in a field that was still quite new to me and still juggling being a mummy. And it's hard little children are hard.
Yeah.
Just hard work.
And you've got 2 of them.
Yeah, and the
the same age.
exhaustion is off the charts.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it takes such a long time to recover from those early years of birth and lack of sleep. But, my kids, I'm so grateful for the close relationship I've got with them. But there was a lot of disrupted years of in and out of, can I get in your bed, mummy, in the middle of the night? And so it was hard to function. But I loved what I was doing, and I was so energized by the people I was around. And I had to get over myself with this lack of confidence and self-belief and it was lovely. I had a boss who, she was effectively the CEO of Google in the UK, who I sort of joined into one of the leadership teams and boards with her. And it was just me and her, with only 2 women at the time on that team. And she just took me under her wing, and she was a fabulous woman. We became really good friends. But she was very strong, and she kind of gave me a good talking to go, you wouldn't be here if you weren't brilliant. Like, it's not easy to get a job here, but you've been picked because you're great. So you've got to stop this, well, I don't know if I can do it kind of thing, which I'd never really been like that. So it was almost also didn't know who that was.
Yeah.
After I had the kids, I at the agency I was at, I set a women at group up. I was really conscious of both my cultural heritage and my gender, and the fact that I was the only woman in the room and the only person of colour in the room most of the time up until that point, but had not ever carried it as a chip on my shoulder. I just used to blast through things.
Yeah.
I don't even know how I did it now sometimes. And I love it because the kids call it, oh my God, you drop so much law, mum, sometimes, which, stories that I, just seem matter of fact to me, but actually reflect and go, yeah, that was not right, or that was weird, or that was incredibly tough. But I think that kind of, again, going back to childhood, that sense of you just got on with it. You didn't complain.
You just did it.
You just did it. And you're a bit of a daydreamer. So I'm a visionary thinker. I think in big vision and determination. I didn't allow these things to get in my way. I just wasn't going to. I was just going to charge through it. And then you hit a point where you go, actually, hold on, I need to change this for other people. Because I started to realise you look left and right and go, hold on a minute, not everyone else is doing this. And never one to think I was special. It was like, hold on, how come I am and they're not? So you're like, right, I need to do something about this. So when I got to Google, and Eileen Norton, who was the CEO at the time, had said to me, and she was incredibly senior in the business, said, I want you to run Women at Google. You've got such a passion for this. I think you can have a real impact and do that. And that was that real step into going, actually, I can really make a difference here. And it really fired something in me of recognising the platform that I had and the opportunity I had, and the fact that I had the skills and the persuasion to go, I could do something about this, or I could try at least.
Yeah.
And then really kind of from that point on became this career of, as I became comfortable, it didn't take long to get comfortable, really not long at all. And then you get more and more used to getting comfortable to your surroundings. I think moving a lot when I was younger and all that change definitely makes me very, very comfortable with ambiguity and change. But it was probably the first time I felt like me, in the sense that, I dropped the mask. I was wearing what I wanted to wear. I was being who I was, and I wasn't scared to be judged for it. And so I'd worked for, a good 15 years before that and never felt that. And I just felt like, even though my kids will tease me and say I went through what they call my Facebook mum era, which they like to laugh about a lot. And I always say to them, it was really hard when you have kids and stuff. And I'd lost complete identity of who I was.
You're a mixture of, are you mummy?
Didn't have a job, I didn't have this, I was a mummy and that, So after those years, the wilderness years of Facebook mum years, I then emerged into this, quite probably conscious character of going, actually, I'm comfortable who I am. And I'm going to be unapologetically me, and found new power in that. And I think that's where unlocking that real sense of having the right supporters around me, being able to be a maverick and do brilliant work at Google to earn the trust that gave the room to do things, and then seeing the impact of it was just magical. Loved it.
If you enjoyed that conversation, please share A Class of Their Own podcast with your friends and family. Subscribe, follow and like. It really helps us continue to grow. Keep being you through connection, learning and play. You are a class of your own.